Good Wednesday morning, everyone. Thank you for tuning in for the Southern Oregon Weather Midweek Update. I'd like to follow the general pattern of the first two videos and start with the short-term forecast. What can we expect for the rest of the week? Then I'd like to look at model trends for this weekend. The last video we were expecting a modest system to come through for the weekend and drop some rain and snow on the Southern Oregon Cascades and Siskiyous. Are those trends holding in the model data? And then I'd like to finish with some long-range considerations. What can we expect as we go into March? So this is the latest GOES satellite imagery from NOAA. Pretty clear skies across the area. You can see some low fog hanging out in between the Rogue and Willamette Valley, southern end of the Willamette Valley. But across our area, generally clear skies. So what can we expect for the rest of the week? Well, right now we're under this easterly flow. You can see these wind barbs coming out of northeastern Oregon and pointing in our direction. That indicates an eastern to northeasterly flow. And what that means is that we're going to see dry conditions, we're going to see clear conditions, but as we've seen the last couple nights, we could see some cooler temps overnight. This morning my thermometer showed 22 or 23 degrees in Medford, so it's quite chilly. And because we're getting this northeasterly flow, we're under the influence of a cold continental air mass. However, daytime highs could get into the upper 50s, even the low 60s. Here we see the Weather Channel's forecast for the next couple days. If you were with us during our last video, we talked about the Weather Channel's reputation for accuracy. That's why I'm showing it here. It's because of their proprietary algorithm that blends the most effective models, the models that have performed the best recently to make its forecast. So Weather Channel calling for highs in the low 60s for Medford for the next couple days. And that's an effect that we often see with easterly to northeasterly flow. We have those winds coming down the west side of the Cascades, and as those winds descend, that air mass warms up and dries out. And especially in the southern end of the Rogue Valley, near Ashland, we could see temps really getting up there, and it will feel spring-like during the daytime, but still expecting us to cool off at night, maybe see some more days of frost. So what can we expect for the weekend? So in the last video, I noted that so far this winter, we've seen some storms appear on the horizon, only to fade like a mirage as they get closer. The models have really been struggling so far this winter, showing storm systems maybe about a week out, and then the trends just get weaker and weaker and weaker. And it's been the same story over the last 24 hours with the system we're expecting for this weekend. I've put together a loop of the 10 latest model runs on the GFS for our weekend system, and you can see the GFS is taking the preset further and further north. And at this point, it looks like we're barely going to see the southern end of the front as it just brushes past our area to the north. The WPC, the Weather Prediction Center, is a little bit more optimistic with the GFS when it comes to rain and snow amounts. But still, you can see the heaviest amounts are going to be over the central and northern Oregon Cascades. And again, we just get brushed by the tail end of the system here in southern Oregon with maybe just a tenth or two of rain, maybe a couple inches of snow at best for the Siskiyous. Once again, I'm including the Weather Prediction Center because compared to some of the other models that we're looking at, the NAM, the North American model, the GFS, the American model, and then the ECMWF, that's the European model, the WPC has actually outperformed these models when it comes to predicting precipitation amounts. So that's why I'm including it here. You can see it's represented by the red bars, and this is a skill score chart, and it shows that WPC model has significantly more skill than some of the other models when it comes to forecasting rainfall. So maybe a tenth or two of an inch from this weekend system at most. So what can we expect going forward? I want to take a big picture view now and show you the current sea surface temperature anomalies. So anomalies are departures from averages. So we see here the warm colors represented by yellow and orange, and then we see the cooler than normal areas represented by blue and purple for significantly cooler than average in some cases. So first feature I want to point out is this cool water off the coast of California and Baja California. That indicates a neutral to negative PMM state. That's called the Pacific Meridional Mode. Then we also notice this warm blob of water north of Hawaii. We also see a warm ENSO 4 region. ENSO refers to the El Nino Southern Oscillation. You might have heard of El Nino and La Nina. It's divided into a couple different regions. Region 1 over by the coast of South America. Region 3.4 is one that forecasters look at a lot of times when they're making an El Nino or La Nina forecast. And then ENSO 4, that region is a little bit farther over, right around the date line at 180. And then the last thing we notice is this neutral to negative IOD, Indian Ocean dipole state, where you have this warmer water north, kind of around Indonesia, Sumatra, and cooler water to the south. So what does all of this mean for our weather in Southern Oregon? Well, the negative PMM here usually indicates cooler temperatures for the west coast, especially in the springtime, especially in March. However, there are a couple factors that counter that. Number one is the Pacific warm pool favoring Pacific ridging. So a lot of the time this winter, we've seen this ridge develop in the Gulf of Alaska, and it's kind of extended toward the west coast and limited the amount of moisture that storms can pick up as they ride over the top of the ridge and drop into the west. It's forced the main storm track mainly over the Rockies and hasn't really allowed storms to drop down the coast into Southern Oregon. So Pacific ridging is kind of a warmer and drier, not a super warm signal for us, but certainly a dry signal for the west coast, which definitely counters the colder and wetter PMM signal. Then we see here around Nino Region 4, that favors MJO phases 6 and 7, which we have seen quite a bit of the time during this winter. Ordinarily, that would favor cooler and wetter conditions in the west and in Oregon, but once again, we have factors like that Pacific ridge countering the Madden-Julian oscillation. And also, as we'll see, when we get into the springtime, those MJO phases have less of a cooler signal for the west, and in fact, when Nino 4, this area that we talked about near the date line, when that is significantly above normal during March, then it means that we can expect warmer and drier conditions along the west coast. Finally, we have the neutral or negative Indian Ocean dipole look, and that usually favors MJO phases 4 and 5, developing into phases 6 and 7 as those MJO waves propagate through the Indian Ocean and into the Pacific. Once again, as we get into spring, MJO phases 4 and 5 are actually more of a warmer and drier look than they were earlier in the winter. So here's how all those factors play into what we can expect for the next 10 days or so. This is day 10 on the GEFS. Again, the U.S. ensemble model, so blending together many different model runs to get an average picture of what we can expect. First up here near the pole in Alaska, I want you to notice all these blue colors. That indicates a positive Arctic oscillation, and that basically means that a lot of cold air is locked up into the Arctic and it can't really spill south into the United States. We can see it trying to over in the east, but in the west here it's pretty much locked up into Alaska and the Arctic. Here we see this Pacific ridge that is a result of a lot of this warm water north of Hawaii, and we see this ridge kind of extending into the west coast. And again, that's the signal we get from ENSO region 4. When that's significantly above normal, as it is right now, we get this ridging, especially during the springtime, this ridging and this warmth. However, we do see the cool PMM, the Pacific Meridional Mode, trying to develop some troughing, maybe into California and the desert southwest. Will that extend far enough north to affect us in Southern Oregon? Maybe we could see some clouds or light shower or two, but we'll have to see how that plays out in about a week to 10 days. So what about the Madden-Julian oscillation, though? I mentioned phases 5, 6, and 7 that we've been seeing a lot of the time during this winter. They have a colder look and a wetter look for the west earlier in the winter. During springtime, they're not nearly as cold and wet for us here in southern Oregon, but they're still in effect. So let's see what the Bureau of Meteorology, the Australian Meteorology Association, has for the Madden-Julian Oscillation forecast. You can see over the next week or so, it takes it into phase 8, and then it takes it into the circle here in the middle. That's called the null phase, where MJO activity really dies out and doesn't have that much of an effect. So if we look at phase 8, there's actually a pretty warm and drier signal for the western United States before the MJO dies out and ceases to have an effect. So if anything, the MJO is going to tilt things in a warmer and drier direction, and then when it fades, the other oscillations, we also call them teleconnections, take over and will have more of an influence. So here's what things look like by day 16 on the GEPS, the Canadian Ensemble, and the GEFS, the American Ensemble. Once again, they're trying to shift this Pacific Ridge off to the west, farther south of the Aleutians. But as we've seen time and time again during the winter, they've tried to shift it further west, only to have the ridge end up closer to the coast and drive a lot of the storminess into the Rockies. So it looks like we'll see pretty much a continuation of the same pattern we've seen over the course of the winter with storms, just brushing us as they pass by to the north and east. And I want to emphasize that when we're looking at a lot of these different patterns, a lot of these different oscillations and teleconnections, we can't just look at one. We can't just look at the Madden-Julian Oscillation or ENSO Region 4. We need to look at them all and see how they interact and see how they balance each other out. And I think on balance, the signal we're getting from all of these oscillations and teleconnections is a warmer and drier signal. Here once again, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, here's the correlation with air temperatures over Oregon for a warmer than average Niño 4 region. So here you have the warmer and drier air shown by the orange and the red colors. And you can see Niño 4 has just been well above average for the past several months actually. And then over on the right hand side here, we can see the correlation for temperatures with that positive Arctic oscillation that I was talking about. A lot of cold air locked up near the Arctic into northern Canada, and not a lot of cold air and storminess making it south. Here's the GEFS forecast for the AO for the next 2 weeks, and you can see it's just remaining well above average. So overall, guys, a warmer and a drier signal. That's certainly what we can expect in the short term. Dry, sunny, and warming until the weekend. And unfortunately, for rain and snow lovers, models have trended weaker with the Sunday cold front. Although we still could see a chance for some light rain and snow possible here in the valley and over the southern Oregon Cascades and Siskiyous. In the long range, we talked about some different signals. Some of them are competing, but overall the signals for dryness and moderate temperatures, like the AO, the fact that MJO is dying, the warm Niño 4 region, and that Pacific warm blob, overall those warm and dry signals outduel the signals for cold and wet, like the Pacific meridional mode and those MJO phases 6 and 7 that usually mean cold for the west. We can hope for wetter and cooler trends if a couple things happen. Number one, the MJO reemerges into those cold and wet phases, or the wavelengths shorten during the spring, meaning that even though there's a ridge in the Gulf of Alaska, storminess is still able to carve out a trough right along the west coast. Thanks so much for tuning in. Don't forget to set your notifications for the weekend update. And please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed this video.